Yeah.
I want to contrast these two this week, which is Parshas Hachodesh, and last week, which is Parshas Parah. It's very interesting. It probably was for a different reason, but the Yerushalmi brings a remez that there is no separation between Parshas Parah and Parshas Hachodesh, because Bein Shlishi LeRevi Lo Yishta, because corresponding with the 4 cups of wine, between the third cup of wine and the fourth cup of wine, one is not allowed to drink. So it's and so the Yerushalmi says that's a sign that there is no week that intervenes. That there's no week that intervenes between Parshas Parah and Parshas Hachodesh. Now there might be many other reasons for it, but I was thinking that maybe included among the reasons could be suggested that there is a certain connection between these two partials. Now, this week is Parshas Hachodesh, and in Parshas Hachodesh, uh, so it starts off by telling us about the mitzvah of Kiddush Hachodesh, of the calendar, that the year of the months begins with Nisan and concludes with the end of Adar. Rishon hu lachem l'chadshei hashana. Nisan is the first month of the year. And here is contained the mitzvah that when there is a Bezdin would declare a particular day as Rosh Chodesh based on the sighting of the new moon. And when there is no Bezdin, so it's based on the calendar. There is a dispute I've mentioned many times between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Ramban Shita was that the last Bezdin that was able to declare the new month enacted the calendar until Mashiach comes, until there'll be another Bezdin who could sanctify the new month on the basis of the sighting of the moon. And all the months of all the years between that time and today, and between that time and when Mashiach comes, so the whole was proclaimed by that last Bezdin. However, the Rambam Shita is that the calendar enables the Jewish people as a nation to declare the new month on the basis of the calendar. In other words, according to the Rambam, when we say Rosh Chodesh Yiyeh, that Rosh Chodesh will be on a particular day of the coming week, so we are acting as Bezdin. We are proclaiming. It's matter of fact, it's more that the Bezdin acts on behalf of the Jewish people, but the Jewish people, and the Rambam points out that's only the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael. It is by their declaration that the date for the new month is declared. This is the shita of the Rambam, the opinion. This is the opinion of the Rambam. But in any case, so the first mitzvah is the first mitzvah contained in Parshas HaChodesh is about the calendar, the declaring of the new month. All that comes within Hachodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim. However, the rest of the parsha focuses on on the Carbon Pesach, on the Pesach sacrifice. Now, and there is a machlokus, there's dispute among the Rishonim. What is the reason that we read Parshas Hachodesh this week? Is it because of Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or is it to serve as a reminder about the Carbon Pesach, about the Pesach sacrifice? But whatever it is, that's the mitzvah. I want to focus in the past, Parshas HaChodesh, I focused on the declaration of the reason the significance of Parsha Chodesh is because of the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh, the mitzvah of declaring the new month, the mitzvah of the calendar. However, I want to focus more on the carbon that's contained, the Carbon Pesach, where every family, every house gave a carbon, gave a sacrifice. The sacrifice was lamb or sheep because they were Egyptian deities. And if the Rambam, taking a look at the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says specifically at this time of the year, because the astrological signs were identified with the sheep. So because of that, the halacha required the Jew to take a sheep, to take a lamb, which was a deity of the Egyptians, and in front of the Egyptians, the Medrash says that they tied. They took it on the 10th of Nisan, and they tied the lamb or the sheep to the bedpost in this somewhat of a disgraceful manner. And they made it known that they planned to sacrifice that sheep. And the Egyptians were scared to raise a finger against the Jewish people. What was the purpose of it? Well, one purpose was to show that the sheep and the lamb was just an animal, not something to be worshipped. And it wasn't just to show. It wasn't just to show the Egyptians. Of course, that played a role also, but it was to show the Jewish people, because unfortunately, what happens is when we become servile, and when we become slaves, and we become part of the environment, of the Egyptian environment, even if we are held in a disgraceful manner in a particular environment, we are considered the low of the low. Nevertheless, we identify with the culture of that country. And there is a tendency for someone who is oppressed to identify with his master, even where the master is an oppressor, and to adopt aspects of that culture, and to identify oneself as part of that group. It's mentioned, okay, there was a certain degree, there was some compulsion, and that even in the concentration camps, sometimes some of the prisoners in the concentration camps would would mimic, but not, but in a serious, from their perspective, was a serious manner. The way the guards acted, the way the Nazis acted, it was a psychological compulsion. But there is a tendency to imitate, for the oppressed to imitate the oppressor, and so I think it was not just for so because of that the Jews were worshipped, because that was part of the culture of Egypt. They worshipped the gods of Egypt. Uzzah, the angel, or the Sar, the officer, the heavenly officer of Mitzrayim, said to God at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, "Why are you drowning the Egyptians? Halolu ovdei avodah zarah, v'halolu ovdei avodah zarah." They are worshiping idols and they are worshiping idols. In other words, the Jewish people were imitating the ways of their oppressor. So because of that, the Torah said to slaughter the god of Egypt in front of the Egyptians. And in order, it was to teach, it was to let the Egyptians know, but even more important, it was to let the Jews know. And it also, in a sense, that came from the servile perspective of the Jew. So in slaughtering the god of Egypt, we not only reinforced our disbelief in the culture and the religion of Egypt, but in a sense, as a result of that, we began to deal with the servile perspective we have. There is a tendency when someone is oppressed, when someone is a slave. So even when he's freed, but there is a lingering impact. There is a lingering impact upon him. And that lingering impact, that even though he no longer works for his master, but he still has some sort of a servile perspective, even if he's far away from his master. But he has a certain perspective of himself, and that perspective of himself is then leads him to be servile to others as well. But so the purpose of the Korban Pesach was to rid the Jew of the attitude that he acquired from his oppressor. And we find other actions that the Jew had to take in order to lighten that impact upon himself. The Hachodesh Baruch Hu told Moshe to tell the Jews to go into the houses of the Egyptians and to take different things from them, whatever they wanted. Why? In other words, a slave, everything he has belongs to the master. The way, if the Jew would go into his former master and say, "I want this, give this to me," and the master feels forced, psychological compulsion to give it to him because he wants the Jew to leave, that is a partial cure from the servile, will serve as a partial cure from the servile perspective that the Egyptian master had. And there were other cases like that also. A matter of fact, from the Rambam, it appears that almost all of Karbonis, the foundation of Karbonis, there were many that disagree, the Ramban especially, with the Rambam. But although in regard to Karban Pesach, the Ramban seems to be in agreement with the Rambam. But in Karbanos in general, there is a dispute between the Ramban and the Rambam. And the Rambam considered the Karbanos to be a lower form of service than tefillah, than davening. And he says the reason the Torah required the Jew to give Karbanos, so he mentions two reasons in two different places, but it's really based on the same idea. One reason is because at that time, the Jews had a drive to give Karbanos, to give sacrifices. And if the Torah did not accommodate that drive would have led them to avodah zarah, to idolatry, which had its karbanos as part of its ritual. But in doing so, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim also says that animals that were worshipped were used for karbanos. In other words, to kill these animals as an act of defiance against the avodah zarah, against the idolatry, against the animal worshiping. So it according to the Rambam, it wasn't just in regard to Karban Pesach, but although Karban Pesach had its special reasons also, but it was in regard to all the sacrifices. On one hand, it was to accommodate the drive for karbanos. On the other hand, it was to negate the avodah zarah, the idolatry. So this was as far as the giving the sheep and the lamb, as far as the Karban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice. It was to overcome the impact and the influence of the oppressor. But when the Jewish people went out of Egypt and they received the Torah and they said, Na'aseh v'nishma, and then it appeared to them that Moshe Rabbeinu did not come down at the moment that they expected him, because they made a mistake in the calculations as to when he's going to come down from Mount Sinai. So they made a golden calf. Now, who instigated it? It was the Erev Rav. Who were the Erev Rav? The Erev Rav were people from Egypt who joined the Jewish people when they left Egypt. Logic would suggest, and I think that I think that these were people who were not necessarily identified as the oppressors of the Jews in Egypt. It could be, I don't know, it could be a group of Egyptians that were influenced or had among them some of the remnants of the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a Asian group that entered Egypt. There's an argument today whether the Hyksos actually entered Egypt in a military fashion. and took over the rulership of Egypt for many years. Or no, they just emigrated to Egypt and eventually they assumed positions of influence in Egypt because they contributed a lot to Egyptian culture, to the Egyptian military might. It was the Hyksos that it's said, they can't tell you for sure, but it's said that the Hyksos were the ones that introduced chariots with horses into Egypt. And of course, the chariots and the horses was the symbol of the military might of Egypt. And Egypt was the military giant at that time. And there is the prevailing theory is that the Hyksos, and they took over the government of Egypt for a certain period of time. And it suggested, again, I can't tell you for sure, it suggested that the Paros in the time of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, well, Yitzchak didn't go down to Egypt. Avram and Yaakov and Yosef were from the Hyksos line. And then Vayokam melech Hachodesh al Mitzrayim, when a new king came, it didn't just mean that a new king came. It was a new line of kings. In other words, historically, it's a fact that the Hyksos were expelled. Certainly, they lost their significance. They lost their position. But there probably was still a strong Hyksos influence in Egypt. Well, whether it was the Hyksos or not, but the fact that they left Egypt together with the Jewish people seems to indicate that they identified to a limited degree with the Jewish people. A person could say because they were like the Hyksos, who did have Yosef, had a relationship with the Paro of his time. Avram had a relationship with the Paro of his time. Yaakov, of course, together with Yosef, had a relationship. So we could say that there clearly was there was a certain involvement between this group in Egypt and the Jewish people. So, and especially later on, they were discriminated, whether it was the Hyksos or it was somebody else, other groups, even though they also did probably certain things against the Jewish people, but they were somewhat oppressed also by the rest of Egyptian society. And as such, they identified with the Jews. They saw some similarities between their situation and the Jews, the situation of the Jews. And when the Jews left Egypt, they decided that they're going to become part of the Jewish nation. Josephus, not that, of course, it's wrong, but Josephus says that the Hyksos were actually, the Hyksos and the Jews were one people. The Jews were the Hyksos, the Hyksos were the Jews. Of course, that's nonsense. But they went through some kind of process of gerus. The Rambam in Hilchos Yisurei Bia warns that when you take a ger, how careful you have to be. And he says that he talks about all the calamities that came from the influence of the Erev Rav in the desert and the tragedies that happened to the Jewish people in the desert. And whose fault was it? It was the fault of the Erev Rav, the influence that they had. But here it was their friends. We had two types of Egyptians. We had the Egyptians that looked down at the Jew. That, and the contrary, the Egyptians who did not want to be identified with the Jewish people. A matter of fact, the Medrashim at the beginning of Shemos suggest that was part of the reason that the oppression against the Jewish people took place. The people, certain things they kept, Loshina Shmam, Loshina Shmabusham, Loshina Shmosam, but to a large degree, they adopted the culture of Egypt. And Egypt was not happy about it. So that was the cause of the oppression of the Jewish people. So, but the Erev Rav, the Erev Rav, they were the ones who were more, probably had a better relationship with the Jews, because perhaps they were oppressed also. Whatever the reason was, perhaps because of the relationship that Abraham and Yaakov and Yosef had with the paros of an earlier group, whatever it is. So they too were had a they left Egypt. They left Egypt together with the Jewish people, and they identified with the Jewish people. But very often what happens when one group identifies with the Jewish people, eventually the Jews identify with them. And perhaps because of the influence that the influence that the group who are close to the Jews has over them, they lead them astray. And the Rambam warned that if you're not careful with gerus, if you're not careful who you take as a ger, they will have an influence and will lead you astray, just as the Erev Rav led the Jewish people astray in the Midbar, in the desert. So apparently this group who identified somewhat with the Jewish people, they and even went out of Egypt with the Jewish people. So they apparently worshiped the calf, they worshiped the cow. And in Egypt, the cow, the Rambam mentions that in his day, the cow was worshipped in India. And from the words in the Moreh Nevuchim, he seems to imply that even in his day in India was worshipped. A person could understand the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim saying that in an earlier period of time, in Egypt, the cow was also worshipped. There were many groups in Egypt, and each group had its own god, had its own deity, had many deities. And from time to time, it would change. And certain groups would change their deity from time to time, very often to accommodate other groups joining with them. So it seems to me that on one hand, when we talk about the Parah Adumah was a deity of a group that identified with the Jews, that in a sense left Egypt together with the Jewish people, that the Jewish people might have perceived as being their friends, even to the degree of becoming one nation with them. And this is something the Torah warns us. And the Rambam points this out in Moreh Nevuchim at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, when they list all the kings of Esav. And the Rambam is wondering, what is the purpose of listing the kings of Esav? What is the purpose? What do we need it in the Torah for? And the Rambam points out the way you can read the psukim. You can read the psukim that the kings of Esav were not really from the nation that they were kings of. It mentions all kinds of places where they were from. Apparently, the Rambam felt those places were not the residences of the original Esav nation, but the custom of the Esav nation. And the Rambam, I think, says even many of the other nations at that time, when it came to take a king, they would take a king from another country, from another group. He says, as contrasted with the Jewish people, who we say, Mikerev achecha tasim alecha melech, from amongst your brothers, you cannot take a foreigner as a king. Why? There are probably many reasons, but one reason is we have to be scared of the outside influence. We have to be on guard of the outside influence. When a king comes from a foreign place, he brings a culture with him. He adapts the two cultures together. When they took somebody who was probably friendly with them. But that's the nature of things. That when you appoint a leader, when you appoint a person to a position of power, they will have an influence. They'll be someone people look up to. And when you look up to a person, the person automatically has an influence upon you. And to a certain degree, we could suggest that when Moshe died, when it appeared to them that Moshe died, this mortal man, Moshe, we don't know what happened to him. So there was a vacuum in leadership. So they turned to the Egyptians, who were, even though they might not have been from Pharaoh's close cabinet, so to say, but they turned to the Egyptians, who were on a higher level, socially higher level than they were in Egypt. And this tendency was used by the Erev Rav to introduce their culture, their avodah zarah, to the Jewish people. And instead of them becoming part of the Jewish people, they saw this as a means of making the Jewish people as part of them. So so we have a double test. On one hand, we have to be scared of the influence and the impact of the culture of our enemies have upon us. At the same time, we have to be very careful about the impact that the culture of those who are friendly to us will have upon us. And to a certain degree, we are facing this test. Many people or I shouldn't say people, those people aren't around anymore to a large degree. But many of those who supported the Jewish people years ago are beginning to have an influence on the Jewish people. And it has affected their environment. And even in religious circles, even in some of the day schools, types of behavior that 30, 40 years ago would have been considered just unacceptable. Today is acceptable. It could be because of the attitude of some of the donors. It could be because of many other reasons. But because we identify with these groups. And at that time, when we identified with the groups, they had a favorable attitude to the Jews, and the Jews had a favorable attitude to them. But now, these groups, besides the immorality that they're injecting in the Jewish nation and the Jewish people, besides the terrible attitudes that has become part of our environment, they are leading Jewish people who would brag about their Jewishness to lead a struggle against the Jewish people. So now this, and one of my Talmidim pointed out to me that immediately after the Paraduma, the Torah warns us about our involvement with the people of Canaan, not to make a bris with them, because sometimes, and also we know, Torah says, "K'mais eretz Mitzrayim u'k'mais eretz Canaan." We're warned not to imitate the ways of Canaan, the ways of Mitzrayim. These were our enemies. But there is a tendency to imitate our enemies. So whether it was our enemies or it was our friend or those that were friends to us, but we have to realize that our culture, our religion is completely separate from them. That when it comes to culture, when it comes to religion, there has to be a complete mechitza. The Torah says in last week's Sedra, Lo savashal di b'chalei vimo. And the Rambam, in explaining it, the Yisur of Lo savashal di b'chalei vimo, he said, two of the three times it's mentioned in the Torah. It's mentioned by Aliyah Laregel. He says his theory is, this is what the Rambam writes, not my theory. The Rambam writes, his theory is that the Ovdei Avodah Zarah, the idolatrous nations, when they had their holidays, they used to cook a kid goat in the milk of its mother. That's why the Torah says, Lo savashal di b'chalei vimo. The Torah doesn't say, Lo savashal basa b'chalav. Okay, there are all kinds of Xeris HaKosimos about it. But the Torah put it in the form in a certain form in order to warn us that when it comes to celebrating our holidays, we shouldn't look at the way the nations of the world celebrate their holidays. We have to do it in accordance with our own tradition. And there was a time where, unfortunately, and even today, you find that I've seen articles written by rabbis. Here it was Reform Rabbi, and he's not necessarily speaking for the. Actually, it was a she, not speaking for the whole movement. Probably not. I don't know, but it's that to suggest it for all kinds of reasons that she tells the people to celebrate Hanukkah at Christmas time. And in the old days, they used to talk about of having a Hanukkah bush. In other words, there's a tendency, and this is with nations that the Jewish people got along with. These were our neighbors. But our neighbors, the people we get along with, could have an influence on us that could then lead us to act not just against our culture, not just against our religion, but against our people as well. We find Jewish senators saying that the United States, which is a lie also, the United States was not in immediate danger from Iran, was not in immediate danger. It could be, they said, that Israel was in immediate danger. But the United States was not in an immediate danger, even though it seems that they had the ability to, in a short while, make atomic bombs, even though they killed so many Americans that they made attempts on the lives of the leaders of the United States. They ignore all this. Why? Because they want to identify these so-called Jewish senators. I call them the capos. These Jewish senators, these Jewish congressmen, because they see their greatness not in their Jewishness. The Jewishness is something that they could use to get Jewish votes, because there are still stupid people that will always vote for the Jewish person. Now we're dealing with stupid people who vote for the person that will oppress the Jew most, who will discriminate against the Jews most, who will do whatever is best for the elements that are opposed to the Jewish people, opposed to the state of Israel. We know that there are cells that were set up by the Iranians. We've been warned about it. Who, because of their frustration now, they did this stuff before also, to attack shuls, and they'll say, "Oh, it's not anti-Semitism; it's anti-Zionism." And do we find, especially on the left, anybody coming out and screaming, "No, it's anti-Semitism"? And many congressmen refuse to vote to identify. I don't know about the Jews, to identify Iran as the as the leading proponent of terrorism in the world today. A terrorist doesn't need a rocket to cause problems. He just has to get over the border. And unfortunately, many of them have already done so. So how can they say there's no immediate threat? The present government in Iran is supporting terrorism. And there are cells all over the world. And you see the same congressman who only a few weeks ago screamed at Trump that he didn't take military action against Iran. When Iran killed 20,000, 30,000 of its own citizens in the street, today are screaming against him that he had no right to invade Iran. Why? You mean in these 2 weeks, the immediate danger for the United States became less? No, but these people, they take pride in their non-Jewishness. They take pride, they see themselves great, not because of their heritage. Their ancestors would be shamed by them. And if their unfortunately, this began during the time of World War II, when the Jewish congressmen and the Jewish senators refused to help their brothers in Europe. And their hands are stained with the blood of the 6 million Jews. The capos were, to a certain degree, forced to act as capos, to act as police over the Jews. Why are these people acting that way? They're acting this way because they see that as giving them esteem. And the truth of the matter is, they will lose all their esteem. Where were the Jews during World War II? To tell Roosevelt, you won our votes, you have to do something for our brothers in Europe. Okay, most of them were immigrants. But today, the Jews are not immigrants anymore. We've been here for a long time. It's just pure desire to see ourselves in a higher position, to get political points, working on behalf of our people. They'll take credit for it, but they'll do the very opposite. These people are worse than the capos. They'll say, there was no immediate threat to the United States, which is a lie also. But there was a threat to Israel. But okay, it's just Israel. It's just Jews. It's just the people that were your brothers. Those that you divorced. It's those people who had the same lineage as you, but a lineage that you cut yourself off from. And if your parents and your grandparents acted that way, you are keeping that tradition of having the blood of your brothers on your hands. This is what we're facing today, because we have to be scared of the influence of 2 groups. We have to be of those that oppress us, and we have to be scared of the impact of those that seem to be closer to us. And we have we have to know that today, unfortunately, what happens that after we are influenced by the people who seem to have been friendly to us, we become influenced by those that were our oppressors. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, no one would have dared talk against waging war against Iran. Everybody recognized who Iran was. How many Americans did they kill? They're still killing them. And they're killing them in the United States. They're using different methods until they're ready to use their main method, which is not far off, which was not far off. We have to understand that, yes, there were people that identified with us and we identified with them. And I'm not saying not to identify, but we have to be on extra guard that they should not have an influence on us, not religiously, not culturally, not politically, and certainly not when the lives of our brothers and sisters are at stake.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. Yeah, there's no questions. Have a good week, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.